Hi everyone, this is Mallory Flowers on behalf of Jennifer Schatz and Associates, and we are coming to you live from Washington, D.C., and welcome to our Webinar Wednesday series. We are hosting a full day of complimentary webinars every 30 minutes until 4:30 p.m. Eastern, and our speakers range from accountants to attorneys and other industry professionals. The full schedule is on our website underneath the webinar tab. In the interest of time, we should not take questions, and our speakers' contact info is posted on the last slide. So if you have any questions, please contact the speaker directly. The recordings are on our website underneath the archived webinar tab, as well as on our YouTube channel. All right, this is just a quick blurb about us. Jennifer Schatz and Associates helps both product and service companies with federal contracting. Our services range from market analysis support to contract vehicles, including the GSA schedule. We can also help you with proposal writing and post-award contract administration. More information about our services can be found on our website. These are some upcoming events in January. More information can be found on these links or on the website. And we now offer advertising in our weekly newsletter and in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. Please contact me for more information. So we're going to go ahead and dig into today's presentation, which is pricing under the microscope and source selection and evaluation. And Michael Gallo is our speaker today. We're going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Mallory. Today, I'd like to talk to you about pricing under the microscope and source selection and evaluation. And before we start, let's talk about the federal contractor side, the company that is proposing on a federal contract. When we talk about pricing, really it boils down to three main factors that a company will consider when they're trying to set the price for their proposal. Really it boils down to a price that's winnable, a price that's profitable, and a price that's ultimately executable, meaning there's enough budget to actually deliver on the promised product or service. But on the government side, on the buyer side, what does the government consider in terms of looking at your pricing and what potential pricing pitfalls hurt your proposal? In this brief webinar today, I'll briefly review the factors and methods government evaluators use for evaluating cost and price. Next, I'll summarize some common pricing pitfalls that hurt a bidder's chances for winning. And then I'll provide some basic top-level strategies to help avoid those pitfalls in the brief time that we have today. And finally, I'll wrap up this webinar with a parting thought, some food for thought on the pricing life cycle. So with that, Mallory, go ahead and flip to the next slide. So how is price evaluated? The government just doesn't look at the bottom line price in their source selection decision. They consider many cost and pricing factors. And on the slide here, we're going to talk about it in two different ways. We'll talk about the factors themselves, what actually the government looks at in your pricing on the left. And then on the right, we'll briefly review the kinds of methods and sources that the government uses when they're trying to assess your cost and pricing. So let's start on the left. The first criteria really should be obvious and really relates to the government's bottom line. Is your price affordable? And really, in the end, if the government doesn't have the budgeted funds to meet your proposal, you could have the best proposal in the world. But if it's not ultimately affordable, you're putting the government in a hard position to get an award. It's not necessarily impossible, but if you propose a price that's higher than what they can afford, you're definitely running the risk of having to have the government open discussions with you. And in that case, you're reducing your chances to ultimately win the award. So affordability is an important consideration right off the top. The next two evaluation factors, is the pricing reasonable and is it realistic, really relate to evaluating whether your bid would be considered prudent in an arm's length open market transaction. And when a price is deemed unreasonable, the government is saying that your cost or price is too high. And conversely, if your bid is deemed unrealistic, and this is probably the more important issue, the government evaluators think your price is too low. So a very simple example of this, an unrealistic pricing might be in a services contract where you're bidding a lot of labor and you're trying to be competitive with your salary rates and you're bidding very low salary rates. In some cases, the government may believe that those salary rates are so low that you're going to be unable to find and retain qualified staff and pay them at those low rates. And then in that case, if the government thinks your price is unrealistic, In a cost reimbursement type contract, the government will adjust your proposed price upward to what they believe is a market range minimum to reflect a more realistic salary. The problem with that is, in a cost reimbursable type contract, in a source selection, the source selection is not necessarily made on your proposed price. The source selection is made on what's known as the most probable cost, or your evaluated price. So when the government adjusts your price upwards, you run the risk then of having ultimately a higher evaluated price. And when compared against the other offerers, you have reduced your chances potentially of winning that award, because now your price compared to the other bidders may in fact be less competitive. So the bottom line here is your probable cost increases because of these adjustments for unrealistic pricing. Your chances of winning potentially decrease. Now, the government may apply some other additional assessments during their evaluation of their pricing, and I've listed them here. The next one is the issue of necessity, or is it necessary? And when we talk about that, we mean, is what you've proposed, the package of costs, consistent with the scope of work requested in the RFP? When we talk about allowable costs, we're ultimately talking about whether or not those costs are costs that the government will pay. And in some cases, even if it's a legitimate cost, if it's deemed an unallowable cost, the government will not pay that and exclude that cost from your price. Is the pricing balanced? In fixed price contracts with multiple contract line items, the government is worried and is concerned about making sure that not only is your whole price fair and reasonable, but the government will evaluate the individual pieces of your CLIN pricing to make sure that they're not significantly overpaying or underpaying on any portion of the contract. So that's all on the question, the left-hand side of the questions that government might ask. On the right-hand side are methods that the government uses to actually perform these evaluations. And we won't go through every single one. I starred the first two because they're the most important. They are the factors that the FAR actually considers the preferred method for government to evaluate bidders' prices. Direct comparison with other offers is the first one. That literally means the government will rack and stack all the offers, proposals, pricing, and do a broad comparison across there to determine whether or not your particular proposal is reasonable against your other peers. So, for example, if your price is $10 million and everybody else's bid is closer to $5 million, then based on this direct comparison method, the government might be led to believe that your price is unreasonable compared to the rest of the offerers. The second method relies on comparison of historical prices paid for similar goods and services as the basis for determining whether or not your price is fair and reasonable. And this is probably a very important one for offerers to consider. So, for example, if the government agency paid $1 million for software on a prior project and you're bidding, let's say, $1.1 million on the current project, that $1 million comparison against history would be an adequate basis for comparison. The government would probably say, well, that looks close enough, that looks reasonable. But as your proposed price goes farther above or farther below that historical analog, you run the risk of the government assessing your price as either unreasonable or unrealistic. So what's important for you to remember about the second methodology is that you have the opportunity to help evaluators when you're submitting your pricing proposal, because oftentimes the RFP pricing instructions will request bidders to quote unquote justify or substantiate or provide evidence for the offerer's proposal. That's a direct request by the government to give them the ammunition and the evidence that they need to turn around and tell their decision makers that your pricing proposal is fair and reasonable. So when you see those kinds of requests in the RFP, you should take them seriously and include what the government has asked in those pricing instructions, not only to make sure your pricing is compliant, but you're also helping the government make the case that your pricing is fair and reasonable and doesn't require any sort of adjustments. The other items on the right may or may not be used by evaluators, and it depends on their particular situation, and they come with their own strengths and weaknesses. My overall advice for you is to try and back up your pricing with historicals from other contracts or provide good vendor quotes when you're submitting things like materials and equipment. Okay, Mallory, next slide. So let's talk about some pitfalls that hurt your chances of winning, pricing pitfalls. And again, they mainly fall into two different types of camps of issues. On the left, we have issues regarding your actual proposal pricing submission. And on the right, we have issues with your pricing strategy, the things that set up your ultimate proposal submission. So let's start on the left-hand side. And let's start off with the very first one, which is kind of, believe it or not, still very important and significant. And that is, many times we have issues with pricing proposals in terms of their compliance with the RFP instructions, and it's a big issue. And this is doubly so for pricing. On large cost reimbursable type contracts that contain complex requirements for preparing the price volume, when you think about it, you're not submitting just one proposal to the government. Oftentimes for these large contracts, you have multiple subcontractors that are also participating in the bid. So it's not really one pricing volume. If you had 5 subcontractors, for example, it's really more like 5 pricing volumes because the government requests similar levels of details from the subcontractors and similar formats, similar pricing exhibits. And that's unlike the technical volume, where you're essentially submitting one volume that represents the integrated solution and approach for the entire team. So that's a key distinction between pricing volumes and all the other volumes in the proposal usually, and why compliance is such an important issue on the pricing side, because they're complex and because they're replicated across the team. So compliance should be at the heart of your pricing volume management and at the top of your to-do list. So the parting thought there is, it doesn't matter if you have a clever or competitive pricing, if ultimately your pricing volume isn't compliant, it's not going to matter and your bid's going to get thrown out. On the next one, the cost and technical inconsistency, I can guarantee you that if the assumptions and scope that's represented in your pricing don't match what's described in your technical volume, you're very likely going to receive an upwards adjustment in your proposed price, because oftentimes when there's a disconnect, usually it's the technical volume has more scope than what is actually priced in the cost volume, usually because there's pricing drills that occur near the end and the two volumes don't necessarily catch up and synchronize to make sure one backs up the other. So a common example of this would be in the staffing area, where you have a complete solution identified in the technical volume for staffing, but lo and behold, when you get to the pricing volume, there was an extra pricing drill that took place and somebody trimmed the staffing, and now there's a disconnect. So the government will look at that and say, okay, based on what's in the technical volume, we're going to upward adjust the baseline in the cost volume to match the technical volume. So once again, your evaluated price is going to be higher than your proposed price on cost type contracts, and you run the risk of having a less competitive bid. Believe it or not, Excel errors are a common problem still to this day, and that's another area where math errors in pricing models hurt your chances and hurt the competitiveness of your pricing bid. We just went through an example. I did an evaluation where a bidder bid fixed fee on a cost reimbursable type contract, but neglected to include that fixed fee in their total price, and they submitted their pricing exhibits and cost volume to the government, and it was a big number. It was like $5 million. So the government acknowledged that error and corrected it. So the evaluated price for that contractor was actually $5 million higher than what that bidder thought that they were proposing. That's an error that should have been caught in the pricing reviews. And if management knew that their price was actually $5 million higher, they may have gone back in and did some more adjustments to the price to make it more competitive. So math errors are definitely a big issue. Poor basis. Well, let's say, for example, you had a engineering contract for software engineers, and in your proposal you bid $100,000 salary for a senior software engineer. Maybe that's a reasonable rate, or maybe that's not. But let's pretend on the government side that they actually thought, hey, this is a pretty specialized skill set, and we don't think $100,000 salary is a realistic salary to attract and retain that type of software engineer. And barring any other evidence provided in your proposal to explain why you think a $100,000 salary is reasonable, the government is left with their judgment, and you run the risk of them again potentially upwardly adjusting that salary to what they think is a more realistic rate and making your pricing less competitive. So the issue here is when your pricing proposal doesn't provide that additional justification and substantiation to back up some of these inputs that you have in your pricing model, you run the risk of the government upwardly adjusting your pricing to make it, in their mind, it's a more realistic price of what they expect they might have to pay, again, on a cost reimbursement type contract. So the point here is when you don't provide this information, you're risking adjustment. So provide this information to the government when requested. Finally, subcontractors. This is actually another big deal. Again, on large contracts, you typically see a lot of subcontractors on the offering team. Subcontractor pricing, in my opinion, is potentially the weakest link in your pricing proposal. And the more subcontractors you have, the more complex and difficult pricing challenges you have in terms of managing this bid. Everything we just talked about in terms of these issues on the prime contractor side equally, if not even more so, apply on the subcontractor side. So, and this is especially true if you have small contractors participating on your bid. Again, if you, with a large contractor, are bidding on cost type contracts, and you have small business subcontractors as your teaming partners, and you're bidding on this cost type contract, those small businesses may not be familiar with all the complex pricing requirements and government cost accounting rules that go with cost type contracts. So it's really important for prime contractors when they're managing the pricing volume with lots of subcontractors to provide clear instructions to the subcontractors, provide good templates, good guidance, and absolutely you must build in time to review subcontractor pricing submissions prior to submitting the entire package to the government, where you run the risk of submitting non-compliant bids or issues with the subcontractors hurting your overall pricing, because again, the government might think that your part is fine. If they think the subcontractor's pricing is low, they again will have the opportunity and may upwardly adjust their price, which ultimately affects the overall price in the bid. So pay attention to your subcontractors. Moving on to pricing strategy issues. Let's think about it this way when we talk about pricing strategy. If the pricing proposal overall reflects building a house, then pricing strategy represents the blueprints that go into building that house. So if you have bad pricing strategy, you're ultimately probably going to have a bad pricing, the number, and a bad pricing volume. So I want to just briefly touch on a couple of these points here. We kind of already touched on the issue of unrealistic pricing that really has to do with upfront assumptions that you're making in deriving your bid, and typically that originates in terms of management challenge, in terms of identifying a pricing target and attempting to hit that pricing target, but maybe not necessarily thinking through what that low pricing target might mean in terms of a realistic bid. Does this reflect enough staff? Does this reflect enough materials, etc.? We just got done talking about numerous subcontractors. So up front, if you're bringing in a lot of subcontractors, you already have potential pricing issues in terms of managing that bid. We also touched on affordability in terms of putting a price together that's too high that the government ultimately can't even afford. That's really indicative of a lack of market awareness and maybe not doing enough homework in terms of researching incumbent and researching the agency. The one I want to touch on a little more closely is the first bullet, and that is the issue of indirect strategies. When you bid on a large contract that represents something that's going to substantially increase your business base, you get a tremendous benefit from that, meaning the larger business base ultimately allows you to spread your fixed indirect costs across a larger base, and it drives your indirect rates down. Those indirect rates, especially when you're bidding again on cost type contracts, need to be incorporated into your pricing volume. Mallory, go ahead and flip to the next slide. Thank you. I think we're going to start running short on time here. So what I'll briefly say is the bottom line represents a typical bidder that bids their straight indirect rates on a large bid. So they're not seeing any favorable impact on their indirect rates, and they're not taking advantage of that in their pricing. The top two lines represent the smarter bidder, where the one below the top represents the smartest type of bid of a company that recognizes, the second one from the bottom, recognizes that the company is going to make investments in their bid, and then they'll see a beneficial decreasing trend once they win that contract. That's the smartest bidder. Go ahead, Mallory, and go to the next slide. So to summarize on pricing pitfalls, read your RFP thoroughly, build a good compliance matrix, follow the matrix. Don't let your proposal manager build the pricing compliance matrix. The lead pricer or the pricing volume manager need to do that. Document and provide the information that's requested from the government to address poor substantiation. Build indirect forecast models to project the beneficial impact from a large contract win. That's something that can be done up front. And adopt top-down sanity checks to help keep optimism in check to increase the likelihood that you're going to put together a realistic bid. Use top-down approaches to double-check your engineering build-up. And Mallory, we'll go ahead and go to the last slide. I'm sorry, we'll back up one. Final thought. There exists a pricing life cycle. Typically, unfortunately, we try and cram all the pricing activity in the RFP stage, and we end up doing a lot of things very poorly. You can get a lot of benefit from doing some of this work up front before the RFP ever drops, especially in terms of doing research on your incumbents and historical contracts, in terms of doing some financial modeling and figuring out how your indirect rates might be favorably impacted if you're pursuing a large contract win. There's a benefit from spreading out this work and getting it done earlier, and there's a benefit that you can achieve in terms of bringing in some consulting support to help you with that earlier in the process, and oftentimes that work can be reused across multiple bids. I want to thank you for attending this webinar today, and I'll turn it back over to Mallory.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for sharing your time with us today, and thank you for everybody who joined us. If you have any questions for him, please contact him directly with the information you see on your screen. And that's it for us today. Thank you.
Thank you.